Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 5, Chant de Dieu. Nicolas Soult, Marshal, Duke of Dalmatia.
Of all the marshals of Napoleon, perhaps none is better known to Englishmen than Jean de Dieu Soult. His long service in the Peninsula, ending with the stern fighting in the Pyrenees and the valley of the Garonne, and the prominent part he took in French politics during the years of the Orleanist monarchy, made his name a household word in England. The son of a small notary of Saint-Amand, a little-known town in the department of the Tarn, Soult was possessed of all the fervor of the South and the cunning and tenacity of a Gascon. Born on March 29, 1769, he early distinguished himself by his precocity and his quickness of perception. Although handicapped by a clubfoot, he determined to be a soldier, and at the age of 16, he enlisted in the Royal Infantry Regiment. His intelligence marked him out for the rank of sergeant, and in 1791, he was sent as sub-lieutenant and drill instructor to a battalion of volunteers of the Haute Rhin. In spite of his lameness and his slight frame, the young sub-lieutenant was possessed of a physique capable of withstanding the greatest fatigue and hardship, and spurred on by ambition, he never shirked a task which might add to his reputation. Consequently, he was soon chosen captain by his comrades, and once war broke out, he speedily rose. At the Battle of Kaiserslautern, the storm of the lines of Weissenberg, and the siege of Fort Louis, he forced himself to the front by his gallantry and his rapid coup d'oeil. But it was the Battle of Fleurus which once and for all established his reputation. Soult was by then colonel and chief of the staff to General Lefebvre. The gallant Marceau's battalions were hurled back en route by the enemy, and their chief in agony rushed up to Lefebvre crying out for 4 battalions of the reserve that he might regain the ground he had lost. "Give them to me," he exclaimed, "or I will blow out my brains." Soult quietly observed that he would thereby only the more endanger his troops. Marceau, indignant at being rebuked by a young staff officer, roughly asked, "And who are you?" "Whoever I am," replied Soult. "I am calm, which you are not. Do not kill yourself, but lead your men to the charge, and you shall have the 4 battalions as soon as we can spare them." Scarcely had he uttered these words than the Austrians fell with fury on Lefebvre's division. For hours the issue hung in the balance, and at last even the stubborn Lefebvre began to think of retreat. But Soult, calmly casting a rapid glance over the field, called out, "If I am not mistaken from what I judge of the enemy's second line, the Austrians are preparing to retreat." A few moments later came the order to advance from Jourdan, the commander-in-chief, and thanks to Soult's soundness of judgment, the divisions of Marceau and Lefebvre were charging the enemy instead of fighting a rearguard action to cover a route. After the battle, the generous Marceau sought out Soult. "Colonel," said he, "forgive the past. You have this day given me a lesson I shall never forget. It is you, in fact, who have gained the battle." Soult had not long to wait for his reward, for in 1794 he was promoted general of brigade. During the campaign of 1795, Soult was entrusted with a light column of 3 battalions of infantry and 6 squadrons of cavalry, and was constantly employed as an advance or rear guard. On one occasion, while covering the retreat at Herborn, his small force was surrounded by 4,000 Austrian cavalry. Summoned to surrender, he indignantly refused, and forming his infantry in 2 columns with the cavalry in the interval between them, during 5 hours he beat off repeated charges of the enemy's horse and fought his way back to the main body without losing a single gun or a single color. 10 days later he added to this triumph by inflicting the loss of 2,000 men on the enemy in the mountain combat at Rat Aig, when both sides struggled to gain the heights knee-deep in snow. During the campaigns of 1796 and 1797, Soult increased his reputation amid the marches and countermarches and battles in the valleys of the Rhine and the Danube. But it was in Switzerland that he laid most firmly the foundation of his future success, for there he gained the friendship and goodwill of MASSÉNA, and it was the conqueror of Zurich who first called Bonaparte's attention to the sterling qualities of the future Duke of Dalmatia, telling the first consul that, for judgment and courage, Soult had scarcely a superior. In 1800, MASSÉNA took his trusty subordinate with him to Italy as lieutenant general of the center of the army. During the fierce struggle, which ended in the Austrians driving the French into Genoa, the lieutenant general was seen at his best, exposing his person in a way he seldom did later, and showing that strategic insight and power of organization for which he was so celebrated. On one occasion, when cornered by Bellegarde, he was summoned to surrender. The Austrian parlementaire pointed out that it was hopeless to continue the struggle as he had neither provisions nor ammunition. To this, Soult replied, "With bayonets and men who know how to use them, one lacks nothing." And in spite of every effort of the enemy, with the white arm, alone he cut his way into Genoa. During the siege, he was MASSÉNA's right hand, ever ready with shrewd advice, the soul of every sortie, till unluckily he was wounded at the combat of Montecreto and captured by the Austrians, whose prisoner he remained till after Marengo. On the establishment of the consulate, Soult, whose politics rested solely on personal ambition and not on principle, at once divined the aims of Bonaparte. Thanks to MASSÉNA's warm introduction and his own reputation, he found himself cordially received by the first consul. Honors were showered upon him. He was one of the 4 trusted commandants of the consular guard, and when Napoleon began to organize his forces for the struggle with England, he entrusted Soult with the command of the important army corps at Boulogne. The first consul could have made no better selection. Under his rough exterior, Soult hid great powers of business, a keen perspicacity, and much tact. Quick-witted, with a subtle, restless spirit, he had great strength of character, and his ambition spurred him on to a diligence which knew neither mental nor physical fatigue. But in spite of his cold air and self-restraint, he loved the pleasures of the table and was passionately fond of women, while his wife exercised a complete domination over him, and before her he quailed like a child. In war, he had the keen imagination and quick penetration of a great strategist. His special forte was the planning of vigorous enterprises, but he preferred to direct rather than to lead. Though his courage was undoubted, as he grew older, he was chary of risking his person, and had not the dashing qualities of Lannes and Ney. As an administrator, he was the equal of DAVOUT. Once entrusted with the command of the army corps at Boulogne, the young general of 35 laid aside all thoughts of personal pleasure and ease and set himself to manufacture a fighting machine which should be the most perfect of its time. Never was such attention shown to details of administration and instruction, and the discipline of the corps at Boulogne was the severest that French troops had ever undergone. As might be expected, there were many grumbles, and soon rumors and complaints reached the first consul, who himself remonstrated with his lieutenant, telling him that the troops would sink under such treatment. But he was greeted with the reply, "Such as cannot withstand the fatigue which I myself undergo will remain at the depot, but those who do stand it will be fit to undertake the conquest of the world." Soult was right in his estimate, for in spite of the demands he made on their endurance, he had won their love and admiration. The weak and the grumblers fell out, and when war was declared, his corps marched to the front, a body of picked men with absolute confidence in their leader. In spite of the fact that he had never held an independent command, there was no surprise when he was included among the number of the marshals. For his brilliant record, his selection as commandant of the guard, his success at Boulogne, and the favor which the first consul had long shown to him, had marked him out as one of the coming men. The campaign of 1805 bore witness to the justness of the emperor's choice. It has often been said, and indeed Wellington himself lent credit to the dictum, that Soult was primarily a strategist and no tactician, but at Austerlitz he showed that calm capacity to read the signs of the conflict, and that knowledge of when and where to strike, which had first brought him to the front in the days of Fleurus. Entrusted with the command of the center, in spite of the entreaties of his subordinates, and even the commands of the emperor, he refused to open his attack until he saw that the Russian left was hopelessly compromised. Thanks to his clearness of foresight, when once he launched his attack, he not only put the issue out of doubt, but completely overwhelmed the Russians. Their left was surrounded and annihilated, while the center and right were driven from the field in complete rout. At the moment when the marshal was directing the movement which wrested from the enemy the key of the position, Napoleon and his staff arrived on the scene. The marshal explained his maneuver and asked the emperor for orders. Carry on, my dear marshal," said the emperor. "You know quite as well as I do how to finish the affair." Then, stretching out his arms to embrace him, he cried out, "My dear marshal, you are the finest tactician in Europe." After the Treaty of Pressburg, Soult's corps remained as part of the Army of Occupation in the valley of the Danube, and in 1806 formed one of the corps of the Grand Army during the Prussian War. At Jena, he had the satisfaction of playing an important part in the battle, for when Ney's rash advance had compromised the situation, it was he who checked the victorious rush of the enemy. But later, the marshal had bitter cause to repent these triumphs won over his rival. Already the enemy of Berthier, and consequently often misrepresented to the emperor, Soult now incurred the bitter hatred of Ney, and what the enmity of Berthier and Ney meant, he found to his cost during the Peninsular War. Immediately after Jena, the marshal was detached in pursuit of the Prussians, and on the day following defeated Marshal Kalkreuth at Greußen and proceeded to blockade Magdeburg. From Magdeburg, he hurried off to join in the pursuit of Blücher, and aided by Bernadotte, he cornered the crafty old Prussian at Lübeck. But brilliant as his performance was, he did not gain the credit he deserved, for on the day of the action, Murat arrived and took over the command, arrogating to himself all the honors of the surrender. The marshal was justly indignant, but, bitterly as he resented the injustice, he was too politic to storm at the emperor like Marshal Lannes. In the terrible campaign in Poland, the marshal added to his laurels. At Eylau, when Augereau had been routed, Davout checked, and Ney and Bernadotte not yet arrived on the field, it was he who warned the emperor against showing any signs of retreat. "Beware of doing so, sire," he exclaimed. "Let us remain the last on the field, and we shall have the honor of the day. From what I have seen, I expect the enemy will retreat in the night." The advice was sound, and the marshal, during the night following the battle, had the pleasure of being the first to perceive that the enemy was retreating, and it was his aide-de-camp who carried the news to headquarters. Well, it was for the emperor that he accepted Soult's advice, for the terrible carnage in the snow had taken the heart out of the troops, and a retreat would have soon degenerated into a rout. So shaken was the French morale that when, on the next day, the emperor rode down the lines, instead of being greeted with cries of "Long live the emperor," he was received with murmurs of "Peace in France," and even "Peace and bread." During the final advance, Soult had his share of the hard fighting at Heilsberg, but he escaped from the horrors of Friedland, as he had been detached to occupy Königsberg. After the Peace of Tilsit, the marshal's corps was cantoned round Stettin, and it was there that in 1808 he received the title of Duke of Dalmatia. The selection of this name caused the Duke much annoyance, for instead of receiving a title which should recall one of his great exploits, as had Ney, Davout, Lannes, Kellerman, and MASSÉNA, his designation was chosen from a country with which he had not the smallest connection, and thus he found himself on a par with Bessières, Maret, and Caulaincourt. What he hankered after was the title of Duke of Austerlitz, but the emperor refused to share the glories of that day. In spite of the huge dotation he received, the marshal added this supposed slight to the many grudges he bore his master. From Stettin, the Duke of Dalmatia was summoned in September 1808 to attend the conference at Erfurt, and from there he was hurriedly dispatched to Spain. The emperor was much displeased with many of his corps commanders, and so on the arrival of the duke, he ordered him to take over from Marshal Bessières the command of the Second Corps. Soult was delighted at the prospect of service. Full of zeal, he set out for his new command, and pushing on in spite of all obstacles, he arrived at his headquarters alone on a jaded post-horse 24 hours before his aides-de-camp. A few days later, he dashed to pieces the semblance of a Spanish army at Gamarol and occupied Burgos, where he was unable to prevent his new command from sacking the town and inflicting every possible horror on the inhabitants. From Burgos, the emperor dispatched him to the northwest, and thus it was that the cavalry of Sir John Moore's army surprised Soult's outpost at Sahagun. The emperor could scarcely believe that an English army had actually dared to advance against his troops. But he at once ordered Soult to cooperate with the divisions he led in person from Madrid, and when he found that the English were bound to escape, he handed over the command to the marshal. The French suffered almost as much as the English in the terrible pursuit, and it was the tried soldiers of both armies who at last met face to face at Corunna. After the battle, Soult wrote to the emperor that without fresh reinforcements, he could effect nothing against the English. But when later he found that the enemy had evacuated Corunna, he claimed that he had won a victory. With a generosity that must be placed to his credit, he took great care of the grave of his adversary, Sir John Moore, and erected a monument with the inscription, Hic cecidit Johannes Moore dux exercitus Britannici in Pugna January 16, 1809, contra Gallos adus Dalmatia ductos. Before leaving for France, the emperor had drawn up a cut-and-dried plan for the systematic conquest of the whole peninsula. The pivot of the whole scheme rested on the supposed ability of Soult to overrun Portugal and drive the British out of Lisbon by February 16, 1809. Unfortunately, Napoleon left one factor out of his calculations, and that the most important, namely the feelings of the Spanish and Portuguese populations. The Duke of Dalmatia very soon perceived the emperor's mistake, but, anxious not to be accused of shirking his task and of allowing himself to be stopped by what were termed bands of ill-armed peasants, he started on his expedition to conquer the Kingdom of Portugal with but 3,000 rounds for his guns and 500,000 cartridges for his infantry, carried on the backs of mules, for owing to the state of the roads in the northwest corner of the peninsula, wheel traffic was impossible. In spite of the difficulties of transport and the murmurs of many of his officers, the indefatigable marshal hurled all obstacles aside and with 16,000 troops forced his way into Oporto on March 29th, 6 weeks behind his scheduled time. But there he had to call a halt, for he had not the men nor the material for a further advance on Lisbon. The situation was by no means reassuring. To reach Oporto, he had been obliged to cut himself adrift from his base, and he had no tidings of what was happening in the rest of the peninsula. During April, he set himself to conciliate the people of Portugal, and at the same time to try and get into touch with the other French corps in Spain. The marshal's attempt at conciliation was on the whole successful, but his kindness resulted in an unsuspected turn in the situation. A movement was started among a certain section of the Portuguese nobility and officials to offer the crown of Portugal to the marshal. The Duke of Dalmatia, greedy and ambitious, but ever cautious, was of opinion that though the emperor might disapprove of the idea, he would accept a fait accompli. Accordingly, he secretly sanctioned the movement and allowed placards to appear in Oporto stating that the Prince Regent, by his departure to Brazil, had formally resigned the crown, and that the only salvation of Portugal would be that the Duke of Dalmatia, the most distinguished of the pupils of the great Napoleon, should ascend the vacant throne. Further, he actually, on April 19th, ordered his chief of the staff to send a circular to commanding officers inviting their cooperation in his seizure of the crown, stating that by so doing they would in no way be disloyal to the emperor. Luckily for the marshal, the arrival of Sir Arthur Wellesley and the English army, before the plot could succeed, once and for all blew aside this cloudy attempt at kingship. For the emperor, on hearing of the affair, although he pardoned the marshal, saying, "I remember nothing but Austerlitz," still wrote in the same dispatch, that it would have been a crime, clear lèse-majesté, an attack on the imperial dignity, and added that it was no wonder that the army grew discontented, since the marshal was working, not for France, but for himself, and that disobedience to the marshal's orders was quite justified. For once, then, the marshal, usually so clever and cautious, had allowed ambition to run away with prudence. Meanwhile, the military situation grew day by day more disquieting. In the French army, there was a section of the officers ready to declare against the empire whenever a chance occurred, and one of them, Argenton by name, actually entered into a treasonable negotiation with Sir Arthur Wellesley. It was thanks to the discovery of this plot that the marshal first got information of his enemy's projected advance. With 30,000 English marching against him and Spanish and Portuguese forces across the main line of retreat, it was impossible to expect to hold Oporto, and accordingly the marshal began preparations for withdrawal. But having secured, as he thought, all the boats on the Douro, he concluded that he could only be attacked by a force ferried across at the river mouth by the boats of the English fleet. Consequently, he kept no watch upstream. So complete was the surprise that an hour after the enemy had effected a landing above the town, the marshal, who had been up all night, was still in bed. His staff were quietly breakfasting when an officer galloped up with the news of the crossing. Soult could do nothing else but give the order to retreat by whatever means possible, and it was fortunate for the French that the pursuit was not pushed harder. But once he had grasped the situation, he made amends for his previous neglect of supervision and showed himself the Soult of Austerlitz and Eylau. Sacrificing his baggage, his guns, and his military chest, guided by a Spanish peddler, he made a most astounding march through the rugged region of Trás-os Montes. Crossing lofty passes, forcing gorges in the teeth of hostile bands of peasantry and guerrillas, by hard fighting and magnificent marching, he brought his troops to safety. The campaign of Oporto did not add to the marshal's reputation. His political ambition was the cause of all the disaster, for it prevented him from supervising his subordinates' operations. It was his fault that there was no proper road for retreat and that he was surprised by the English army. Still, though he had committed great faults, he had shown a surprising ability in extricating himself from their consequences. When Soult reached Lugo, in Spain, he found his rival Ney, from whom he begged stores and equipments, and with whom he was bound to confer on the general situation. Ney at first magnanimously granted the marshal's requests, but unfortunately the men of Ney's corps greeted the armed rabble, which followed Soult's standards with jeers and execrations, and the quarrel spread from the men to the officers, and at last to the marshals. So fierce were Ney's taunts that Soult actually drew his sword, and a duel was with difficulty averted. Thereafter, Soult, while promising to cooperate with Ney in the pacification of Galicia, actually did nothing and seriously compromised his rival, whereon Ney refused to obey any orders given by the Duke of Dalmatia. Such was the situation when a summons from Madrid called the two marshals to the succor of Joseph, who was threatened by the combined armies of Cuesta and Sir Arthur Wellesley in the valley of the Tagus. The marshals arrived in time to save Madrid, but not in time to surround the Allies, who escaped south across the Tagus, and the one chance of success the Spanish offered them was lost, since Soult, eager for personal aggrandizement, attacked Albuquerque before Marshal Victor had time to arrive on the scene of action. The consequence of this was far-reaching, for Victor, like Ney, refused in future to work in conjunction with Soult. Moreover, when a council was held to decide on the next operations, and Soult, wisely, no doubt, insisted that at Lisbon lay the key to the situation, all the other marshals voted against his scheme, as each one determined that he would not be made subordinate to the Duke of Dalmatia. Soult accordingly had to content himself with occupying the valley of the Tagus, while the other marshals returned to the districts which had been allotted to them before the Allied advance on Madrid. While contemplating this unsatisfactory situation, the Duke of Dalmatia was rejoiced to receive a dispatch from the Emperor appointing him Major General of the forces in Spain in place of Jourdan, and entrusting him with the invasion of Andalusia. Before setting out for the south, Soult had the satisfaction of completely routing the Spaniards at Ocaña. It was early in 1810 that he entered Andalusia and seized Seville, Granada, and Malaga. The marshal found himself in the congenial position of absolute ruler of the richest provinces of Spain. But though the important towns fell easily, and with them the accumulated riches of centuries, the people remained sullenly hostile, and bands of armed peasantry hung ever on the rear and flanks of the French columns, and stragglers and dispatch riders were found by the roadside with their throats cut. To meet this situation, at the emperor's orders, Soult issued a proclamation setting forth that whereas Joseph Bonaparte was king of Spain and no Spanish government existed, all Spaniards taken in arms were rebels against his Catholic Majesty and would be immediately shot. The Cortes from Cadiz replied by at once issuing a counter-proclamation stating that for every Spaniard executed and for every house burned, 3 Frenchmen should be hung. Still, in spite of this war of reprisals, the French gradually tightened their grip on southern Spain, and soon Cadiz remained the only important fortress still in the hands of the enemy. The Marshal found it was impossible to take this important position by storm, and contented himself with masking it by a strong corps under Marshal Victor. Meanwhile, he was busily engaged in organizing the new government of Andalusia, and so successful were his efforts that neither the Spanish government at Cadiz or the constant incursions of Spanish and British armies were able to shake his hold on that province. But wise and successful as were his methods, the glory of his rule was darkened by his harshness and greed. The churches and convents were ruthlessly despoiled of their treasures, and many a fine Murillo and Velázquez was dispatched to Paris to decorate his salons. In the eyes of the Duke of Dalmatia, Andalusia was a vast reservoir of wealth, which might be used as a base from which a well-equipped force could threaten Lisbon, the real focus of all the opposition to the French domination of the peninsula. It was in pursuance of this plan that he conciliated the municipal authorities, strengthened the police, and built up huge reserve magazines by a system of imposts so carefully arranged that they should not unduly press on the Spanish population. But unfortunately for the Duke's schemes, they ran counter to those of King Joseph. For the Marshal determined to use the wealth of his rich provinces for the special object of an attack on the British power at Lisbon. But Joseph desired that the revenue thus acquired should be sent to assist him to maintain his kingly state. Soult, strong in his position as Major General and backed by the Emperor's approval, refused to listen to the demands of the king, and there began a struggle which did more than anything else to bring about the fall of the Napoleonic Kingdom of Spain. In spite of the fact that the Marshal gradually wore down the guerrillas, actually raised and trained large bodies of Spanish troops, built up vast magazines and arsenals at Seville, exploited the lead mines at Linares and the copper mines of the Rio Tinto, established foundries for military accessories, and fitted out privateers, the jealousy of Joseph brought the Marshal's great schemes to naught. The continual and vexatious demands of the king acted in a most unfortunate way on Soult's character. For this stupid opposition so irritated his hard and egotistical nature that he saw in every scheme not planned by himself a desire to belittle his glory. Unfortunately for his own reputation and the success of the French arms, he allowed this feeling to obscure his judgment, and he refused to give more than a half-hearted cooperation to any measures not actually suggested by himself. Thus it was that, in spite of the commands of the Emperor and the entreaties of Joseph, he refused to make any attempt to cooperate with MASSÉNA in his advance on Portugal until it was too late. Then, when he actually did advance, he showed all his old energy and skill, for in 50 days he mastered 4 fortresses and invested a 5th. He captured 20,000 prisoners and killed or dispersed 10,000 men, but he disregarded the main objective, the expulsion of the English from Lisbon, and contented himself with the siege of Badajoz, and thus, while winning a fortress, he lost a kingdom. From want of his cooperation, MASSÉNA was forced to retreat, and the grip of the English on the peninsula was more firmly established than ever. Badajoz was soon to prove itself a place of ill omen for Soult, for a few months later, when an Anglo-Portuguese army under Beresford laid siege to it, he was forced to come to its rescue. It was in the attempt to relieve this fortress that the terrible Battle of Albuera was fought. At the commencement of the fight, the Marshal, by a masterly maneuver, threw himself across the Allied right flank and seized the hill that dominated the position, and it looked as if the Allied lines were bound to be crumpled up. But a brigade of English infantry stood firm amid the rout, and with measured volleys checked the victorious advance of the elated French. Soult, by every effort of voice and gesture, attempted to force his veterans to face the foe, but in vain. Nothing could conquer that astounding infantry. No sudden burst of undisciplined valor, no nervous enthusiasm weakened the stability of their order. Their flashing eyes were bent on the dark columns in their front. Their measured tread shook the ground. Their dreadful volleys swept away the head of every formation. Their deafening shouts overpowered the discordant cries that broke from all parts of the tumultuous crowd, as slowly and with a horrid carnage it was pushed by the incessant vigor of the attack to the farthest edge of the hill. In vain did the French reserve mix with the struggling multitude to sustain the fight. Their efforts only increased the immediate confusion, and the mighty mass, breaking off like a loosened cliff, went headlong down the steep. The rain flowed after in a stream discolored by blood, and 1,800 unwounded men, the remnant of 6,000 unconquerable British soldiers, stood triumphant on the fatal hill. Thus Napier describes the Battle of Albuera. So nearly a magnificent victory for the French, turned by British valor into a defeat. But it was not only the valor of the enemy which cost Soult his success, it was his own errors. The commencement of the attack was a magnificent conception, but the marshal failed to understand the tactics of his enemy, and it was his blind attempt to crush the line with heavy columns which allowed the English musket fire to annihilate his dense masses. After the cessation of the combat, he committed another great fault. Though his attack had been beaten back, it was known that the Allies had suffered much more severely than the French, and on the strength of this, he claimed a signal victory. But instead of holding his ground, he withdrew a day later, whereas if he had shown a confident front, Beresford would have been bound to retire, and Badajoz would have been relieved. After the Battle of Albuera, Soult was reinforced by the army of Portugal under Marmont. But discord soon broke out between the two marshals, the Duke of Dalmatia maintaining that the way to attack Lisbon was from his own base in the south, and the Duke of Ragusa advocating the northern route. After lying together for some time, the two armies separated, and Soult moved south to complete his operations against Cadiz and Gibraltar. It was while the marshal was thus engaged, early in 1812, that the Duke of Wellington suddenly captured Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz, and was thus able, after defeating Marmont at Salamanca, to march in the summer on Madrid. Soult replied to Joseph's summons to come to his help by telling him that his best policy was to join him in Andalusia and make a counterstroke at Lisbon. But the king refused to listen to this wise advice, so the marshal was obliged to give up all his achievements and go to Joseph's help. Meanwhile, the king wrote complaining to the emperor, but Napoleon replied that Soult was the only military head in Spain and could not be moved. But after more bickering, early in 1813, Joseph wrote to say that if the marshal remained in Spain, he himself must leave the country, and the emperor, anxious to regain his military prestige, so weakened by the Russian campaign, was glad to summon the Duke of Dalmatia to the Grand Army. But Soult's gloomy prophecy was soon fulfilled that the loss of Andalusia and the raising of the siege of Cadiz are events that will be felt throughout the whole of Europe. The marshal's service at the head of the Imperial Guard was terminated by the news of the fatal Battle of Vittoria, for the emperor immediately hurried him back to try to prevent the English from forcing the barrier of the Pyrenees. The Duke of Dalmatia gladly accepted the mission, in spite of the repugnance of the Duchess, who hated Spain, where, as she said, nothing is got but blows. So hearty was her dislike of the country that she actually went to the emperor, saying her husband was too shattered in health for the task. But she met with a stern rebuff. "Madam," said Napoleon, "recollect I am not your husband. If I were, you should conduct yourself very differently." The campaign of the Pyrenees bore ample testimony to the wisdom of the confidence the emperor had placed in the power of his lieutenant. With marvelous sagacity, Soult reorganized the scattered relics of the French armies, and within 10 days of his arrival at headquarters, he was ready to assume the offensive, and actually all but surprised the Duke of Wellington at Sororan. But great as were his strategical powers and his methods of organization, he was no match for Wellington on the field of battle, and step by step he was forced back into France. Round Bayonne, he showed his complete mastery of the art of war by the admirable way he used his command of the inner lines always to oppose the enemy's attack by superior force. Then, when retreat was inevitable, instead of falling back towards Paris, he withdrew south, thus forcing his adversary to divide up his army. for the English had to detach a strong division to cover their communications at Bordeaux. During the retreat, again and again Soult turned at bay, at Orthez and many another good position. But Wellington ever outmaneuvered him on the field and even turned him out of the seemingly impregnable position of Toulouse. Never was a retreat more admirably carried out. Every opportunity afforded by the ground, every advantage of position was seized on, to use to the full the French dash in the attack. No more admirable illustration can be found of the truth that the essence of defense lies in a vigorous local offense. Wellington himself bore testimony to Soult's virtues, maintaining that of the marshals he was second only to MASSÉNA. With the Restoration, the Marshal at once accepted the change of government and gave his adhesion to the Bourbons. His general reputation and the high place he held in the opinion of Wellington and others caused the king in the December of 1814 to appoint him Minister of War. Such was his position when news arrived of Napoleon's landing at Fréjus. The Duke of Dalmatia did all in his power to organize resistance to the emperor's advance, but he had many enemies, and the king, listening to their advice, replaced him as minister by Clark, Duke of Feltre. Soult then retired to his country estate at Villeneuve-l'Étang, near St. Cloud. On his arrival at Paris, the emperor at once sent for him, but at first he refused to go to court. Ultimately, finding the emperor's cause in the ascendant, he cast aside hesitation and threw in his lot with him. It has been said that the Duke betrayed the Bourbons and was privy to the emperor's return, but this is a calumny. Napoleon, at St. Helena, said, "Soult did not betray Louis, nor was he privy to my return. For some days he thought that I was mad, and that I must certainly be lost." Notwithstanding this, appearances were so against him, and without intending it, his acts turned out to be so favorable to my project, that were I on his jury and deprived of what I know, I should have condemned him for having betrayed Louis. But he really was not privy to it. The emperor joyfully accepted the marshal's adherence and made him one of his new peers, and when war was imminent, on the advice of Davout, he created him major general and chief of the staff. This selection was unfortunate. Good strategist and organizer, he was not the man the emperor required. Berthier, who had not half his military ability, had made an excellent chief of the staff, because he had the rare quality of effacing his own ideas and acting simply as the recorder and expander of those of Napoleon. But Soult was accustomed to think for himself, and his mind was unable to attune itself to the mind of the emperor. Further, from long experience, Berthier was accustomed to fill up gaps in the emperor's orders in the way he intended. But Soult had never so far worked in close cooperation with Napoleon, and after years of independent command, was more accustomed to give orders to his own chief of the staff than to work out minutiae for another. Consequently, all through the Waterloo campaign, the staff work was badly done. Orders were faultily drafted, mistakes were made in their dispatch, and the emperor was constantly bewailing the loss of that brute Berthier. A typical example of the friction which arose between the emperor and his new major general occurred when, at Waterloo, Napoleon asked Soult if he had sent to Grouchy intelligence of the approach of the Prussians. The marshal replied, "Yes, I have sent an officer." "One officer," cried Napoleon. "Ah, if only my poor Berthier had been here, he would have sent 6. To add to these troubles, Soult was unfortunately hated by the officers of the army, who regarded him with grave suspicion. But though the marshal must bear his share in the disaster of Waterloo, it is only fair to add that the morning of the battle, he, and he alone, warned the emperor of the magnitude of the coming struggle, and entreated him to recall at least a portion of Grouchy's command. The emperor roughly rejected his advice with the words, "You think that because Wellington defeated you, he must be a great general. I tell you that he is a bad general, that the English are bad troops, and that this will be the affair of a déjeuner." The marshal, with the memory of many a battle with these poor troops from Oporto to Toulouse, could only sorrowfully say, "I hope so." On the second restoration, the Duke of Dalmatia found himself included among the proscribed, and for 3 years he retired to the Duchy of Berg, the home of his wife, during which time he occupied himself in the composition of his memoirs. But in May 1819 he was recalled to France, and soon found means of ingratiating himself with the Bourbons. In January 1820, his marshals Botten and his other honors were restored to him, and he entered the field of politics. With his vast income, acquired from the spoils of nearly every country in Europe, he maintained his high rank in lordly fashion. A visitor who in 1822 went to see his famous collection of pictures thus describes him. "We were received by the marshal, a middle-sized though somewhat corpulent personage of from 50 to 60 years of age, whose dark curling hair rendered somewhat conspicuous the bald patch in the middle of his head, while his sunburnt complexion accorded well with his dark, intelligent eye. His plain stock, plain dark coat, and loose blue trousers, which, capacious as they were, could not hide his bow-legged form, obviously suggested the soldier rather than the courtier, the marshal rather than the duke. Though, if I had encountered such a figure in London, I should rather have guessed him an honest East or West Indian captain." The marshal knew well how to win favor with the new government, and when the reactionaries attempted to restore the ancient position of the church, no one was more regular in his attendance at church festivals and processions than the Duke of Dalmatia, who always appeared with an enormous breviary carried before him. Though people were unkind enough to say that it would be more to the purpose if he restored some of the vast plunder of the churches and monasteries of Spain. With the fall of the Bourbon dynasty in 1830, the subtle old soldier at once gave his adherence to the Orleanists and was appointed Minister of War, and it was thanks to his energy and wisdom that the numerous revolts which threatened the early days of the new regime were stamped out. Soult, like Wellington, hated the idea of civil war, but knew that strong measures were the best means to prevent bloodshed. So when, as at Lyons, it was essential to strike, he took good care to have the necessary force at hand. A year later, when the Commune threatened to raise its head in Paris, he overawed the mob by the sudden mobilization of 80,000 troops. The weakness of the government and the courage and decision the marshal showed during the émeute caused Louis-Philippe on October 18, 1832, to entrust him with the headship of the administration. The marshal proved how often a strong soldier may be a weak politician, and in 1834 he resigned office. But during his term of office he did not forget the needs of the army, as his measures for recruiting, military pensions, and the training of officers prove. When again in 1839 Paris was seething with discontent, the king sent for the marshal, and under his iron hand order was easily re-established. But the old soldier was no orator, and was listened to more from respect for his character than the cogency of his arguments. And when the crisis was past, he was soon glad to resign his appointment, and though always taking an active part and ever ready to give his advice to his sovereign, he never again held office. In 1838, the Duke of Dalmatia visited London as representative of France at the coronation of Queen Victoria, and once again met his old opponent, the Duke of Wellington. Lady Salisbury thus describes their meeting. "The Duke and Soult met in the music room at the Queen's concert for the first time for many years, and shook hands. Soult's appearance is different from what I expected. He is a gentlemanlike old man with rather a benevolent cast of countenance, such as I should have expected in William Penn or Washington, tall and rather stooping, the top of the head bald. The Duke, though the lines on his face are deeper, has a fresher color and a brighter eye." The Duke of Dalmatia clung to the Orleanist dynasty till the end, and attended the last council held by Louis-Philippe. He had a special liking for the citizen monarch, who reciprocated this affection and had in 1847 re-established for the veteran the title of Marshal General of France, a designation held previously only by Turenne, Villars, and Saxe. With the fall of the dynasty, he appeared no more in public, and at last, on November 26, 1857, he died at his chateau at Saint-Amand in his 82nd year. Soult is able, but too ambitious. Thus, Napoleon appreciated the Duke of Dalmatia when discussing the characters of his marshals. But Soult was possessed of a crafty caution, which seldom, if ever, allowed his ambition to hinder the success his ability deserved. Cold and calculating by nature, he knew exactly where to draw the line. The attempt to seize the throne of Portugal was the only occasion on which he seemed to throw caution to the winds. And those who knew him best were so astounded at his lack of circumspection that they could scarcely believe that he himself approved of the proclamations which appeared in Oporto. The hard, crafty nature of the marshal was responsible for his many enemies among the officers of the army. His own staff never loved him, much as they marveled at his indefatigable industry and his suppleness of mind, which permitted him to turn with ease from the highest political and strategic problems to the drudgery of administrative details, and bring to bear on all questions the cold, hard light of lucid reasoning. He could attract men to him by sheer admiration of his ability, but he could make no real friends, for those who came in contact with him soon discovered that he only thought of what he could make out of them, and then that he would drop them without the slightest regret. Sprung from the lower ranks of society, the marshal had all the cunning and avarice of the typical bourgeois. And though he had the capacity to overcome his want of education, he had not the power to eradicate these inherent strains of character. Though not so rapacious as MASSÉNA, the Duke of Dalmatia never withheld his hand when plunder offered itself, and his home in Paris was decorated with magnificent objects of art filched from nearly every country in Europe. But though he allowed himself the luxury of taking what seized his fancy, he sternly repressed marauding on the part of his officers and men. Hence it was that, like Suchet, he was able to subdue the provinces committed to his charge and win the respect and obedience of the Spaniards. His methodical mind hated the idea of disorder. Administration came to him as nature's gift. Under his rule, Andalusia gained a prosperity she had never before known. But we must remember that his success in this province was due not only to his great gift of administration, but also to his ambition, for it was the driving power of self-interest which supplied the energy which oiled the wheels of his system. For the marshal hoped with the resources of Andalusia to supply the material and means to drive the English from Lisbon without the cooperation of King Joseph or the other French commanders. In striking contrast to the aversion with which he was regarded by his own fellow countrymen was the feeling of admiration with which he was viewed by his foes, and notably by his English adversaries in the peninsula. They only saw the results of his great versatility and resource, and his acts of courtesy to those who fell into his power, while the discipline he maintained among his troops stood in striking contrast to the conduct of many of the other French commanders. Moreover, the marshal was too politic to be cruel, and it was easy to guess that his proclamation against the Spaniards was really the work of the emperor. That this was the case was borne out by the following letter written by BERTHIER at Napoleon's dictation. Let the Duke of Dalmatia know that I learn with indignation that some of the prisoners taken at Ocaña have been released and their arms restored to them. When I witness such behavior, I ask, is this treason or imbecility? Is it then only French blood that is to flow in Spain without regret and without vengeance? As a soldier, the marshal stands high among his compeers. In spite of his defeats at Oporto, Albuera, and Toulouse, throughout his career he clearly showed that he had the essential quality of a great commander, the ability to see and the capacity to perform what was possible with the material at hand. His strategic insight was great. He had a magnificent eye for country and the power of calmly surveying a field of battle. But, as Wellington pointed out, he had one great fault. For though he knew how to bring his troops to the field, he did not know so well how to use them when he had brought them up. Thus it was that at Sorauren, after he had surprised Wellington and upset the whole of the English strategic plans, he was unable to win the battle which was necessary to reap the harvest of his labors. But the passage of the Pyrenees, the operations round Bayonne, and the retreat on Toulouse will always be studied as examples of the most perfect military operations of their type. They show to the full the secret of the marshal's success as a soldier, the blending of ardor with method and dash with caution. As a politician, the Duke of Dalmatia met with little success. His methods were those of a dictator rather than those of a statesman. When the hour of action was past, he invariably showed weakness. But whatever were his faults, it must be laid to his credit that throughout the reign of Louis Philippe he lent all the weight of his great name and reputation to the maintenance of order at home and peace abroad.
This concludes Chapter 5 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 6 about Jean. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.